Imagine you're a farmer in ancient China. Each year, you watch your harvest suffer as more young men from your village are taken from the farms and drafted into wars started by nobles you've never met and being fought far away over lands you'll never see. Your ruler demands expensive tributes that leave your family hungry while hosting lavish feasts and ceremonies that could feed entire villages. And when your neighbor dies, their family is expected to spend their entire life savings on an elaborate funeral because that's just how things are done. But what if someone came along and told you that it didn't have to be that way? Enter Mo Di, or Mozi, Master Mo, a political reformer and philosopher who rose to prominence during the chaos of ancient China's warring states period, around the late 5th century BC. Mozi and his followers birthed a philosophical movement that challenged some of the deepest held assumptions about how ancient Chinese society worked. And they did so using rigorous and systematic philosophical argumentation. They developed ideas so revolutionary and important that they would go on to influence Chinese philosophy for centuries. They were also all-around badasses and lived in ascetic communities, working as sort of roaming defense contractors for hire to help smaller states defend against aggressive neighbors who wanted to invade. But for many unfortunate reasons, you've probably never heard of them. Today, on Frank Philosophy, we'll try and fix that by introducing you to the most important philosophers you've never heard of, the Mohists. Most of what we know about the Mohists and their enigmatic leader Mo Di comes from the text bearing his name, the Mozi, which was written and compiled by his followers. We find references to Mohism and story of Mohists in later warring states' writings, like the Zhuangzi and the Lu Shi Chenqiu, but there's very little known about the master himself, Mo Di. It doesn't help that the Mozi is mostly written in essay form, arguing for and replying to objections against the Mohists' core philosophical positions. There are not many dialogues that show Mozi engaging with other people that give us the chance to get to know the guy. Unlike the Analects, for example, which paints a vivid picture of Confucius through numerous dialogues and tales of his interactions with his students and others. But even though precious little is known about the man himself, there are a few theories about what sort of person he might have been. Some think that he was a disgruntled follower of Confucius, given his clear education and erudition. Others think he might have been a convict who had his face tattooed, given that the word Mo means ink, and is a very uncommon surname. But both of these ideas are highly speculative and too specific. Most likely Mozi and his followers were part of a growing class of successful craftsmen and merchants who emerged as the Zhou dynasty fell into decline and gave way to the warring states period. Some members of this new class managed to receive an education, and no doubt some were pretty upset with the way that things were going at that time in China. The Mozi is full of craft metaphors and references to practical work and a genuine concern for the most impoverished and desperate members of society, all of which points to a blue-collar background. Mozi and his followers probably just looked around at their war-torn society and saw problems that needed practical solutions that weren't being provided by the Confucian elites. While the Confucians focused on learning how to become a gentleman, the Mohists asked more pressing questions, like, how do we stop these endless wars? Or how do we help the poor? Or why waste resources on elaborate funerals when people are starving in the streets? So the Mohists weren't just philosophers, they were activists and, well, defense contractors. Mohist groups operated almost like a combination of a philosophical school, an engineering guild, and a volunteer fire department. They would rush to defend smaller states against aggressive larger states, using their expertise in defensive warfare and fortifications. They also lived austere lives, rejecting luxury and practicing what they preached. So what did they actually preach? The Mohists developed their ideas into 10 core doctrines that they explained and defended throughout the Mozi text. First, they believed that government positions should be filled based on merit, not birth. This was the doctrine of promoting the worthy. Instead of nobles inheriting power and giving their positions to their incompetent friends and family members, they wanted a system where the most capable and moral people would rise to leadership roles. Second, they argued that everyone in a society should identify upward, learning from and emulating those who demonstrated wisdom and virtue, and who ideally would be in power. The idea was that people should be able to look up to their leaders as role models, and furthermore, that doing so would lead to a more peaceful and prosperous society. Third, they promoted what they called inclusive care, also translated as universal love. The idea that we should care about everyone's welfare, not just that of our family or state. Now, it's a tricky interpretive issue exactly what the doctrine entails. Sometimes it seems like a minimal concern for others and treating them with kindness when we can, while other times it seems like a more radical self-sacrificing altruism. We'll talk about these possibilities in a later video, but in the meantime, your Mohism may vary. Fourth, they condemned aggressive warfare as nothing more than large-scale theft and murder. To do so, they ask a simple but profound question. Why do we punish people who steal from their neighbors, but then support and even praise rulers when they do even worse harm to the neighboring states? With these questions, the Mohists identified a key moral inconsistency, underpinning the entire warring states mindset, and in turn developing a systematic moral philosophy that could systematically give answers to questions of right and wrong by appealing to objective moral standards. But more about that later. The fifth and sixth doctrine are about frugal economic policies. The Mohists advocated for moderation in spending and simplicity in funerals, which was a serious issue in ancient China. The Zhou dynasty developed elaborate rituals that served to reinforce the ruler's authority, and the rulers of the various warring states sought to imitate their grandeur by spending vast amounts of resources on luxurious ceremonies and elaborate rituals. The Mohists thought this use of resources was utterly wasteful and considered it not just inefficient, but also harmful to society and even immoral. The seventh doctrine is called the will of heaven. The Mohists believed that heaven, a sort of sky deity, was a model of impartial moral behavior that we should emulate in our own conduct. Heaven cares for everything equally, rewarding the good and punishing the wicked, and we should do the same. They also believed in spirits and ghosts, which is the eighth doctrine. These ghosts and spirits draw from early Chinese folk religion, and they would reward the good and punish the evil as well. Now I know what you're thinking. This is all just superstitious nonsense. But in actuality, it was an ingenious way of arguing for the existence of objective and universal moral standards in a world where they didn't really exist before. Before the Mohists came along, morality was just whatever my state or family or tradition says. But the Mohists instead believed that there was an objective moral order to the universe, and what it means to be a good person is to identify it and follow it consistently. The ninth and 10th doctrines reject the two ideals associated with the Confucian tradition. The first is against music, which relates to Mohist economic doctrines. The Confucians promoted a tradition of state ceremonies that involved these huge musical performances with elaborate instruments like chimes and bells that could easily bankrupt a village. As you might imagine, the Mohists completely opposed these traditions as wasteful entitlement for the elites. The 10th doctrine is the rejection of fatalism, which they understood as the idea that our fate is predetermined, and as a result, nothing we do can actually affect what happens to us. We get hints of this view in the Analects and the Zhuangzi, for example, but the Mohists completely opposed it on the grounds of its being demotivating. Since why would anyone do anything if they were convinced that nothing they did really matters? The Mohists were strong believers that human effort and good governance could create a better world, so they had to reject the doctrine of fatalism. So that's Mohism, a systematic, radical political philosophy, ethics, and philosophy of religion. A true philosophical system that challenged some of the most fundamental notions of early Chinese society and thought. But if these guys were such impressive and systematic thinkers, what happened to them? Well, despite their popularity and influence during the Warring States period, Mohism eventually declined. When China was unified under the Qin dynasty in 221 BC, their expertise in defending smaller states became less relevant since states were no longer at war. Their austere lifestyle and opposition to traditional ceremonies made them less appealing to rulers and elites. But most importantly, many of their best ideas were absorbed into the mainstream Confucian thought, while the more radical proposals that remained sort of fell out of favor and were eventually forgotten. They were, in a real sense, victims of their own success. But their influence lived on. They were among the first in world history to develop a sophisticated consequentialist ethical theory, judging actions by their results rather than by rigid rules. They promoted ideas like meritocracy and state responsibility for public welfare that would take centuries to catch on elsewhere. They were even the first in China to study logic and scientific reasoning systematically. While their school eventually disappeared, the questions the Mohists asked remained relevant today. How do we create a fair and peaceful society? How do we balance tradition with reform? And most importantly, how do we move from asking these questions to actually making things happen? Thanks for watching, and if you learned something today, be sure to subscribe for more Frank Philosophy.